Hello, everyone. I wanted to talk about this chapter with you a little bit. The Ellis's Back to the Future, the pedagogical promise of the multimedia essay. I do want to start, though, by saying I've really been impressed with the level of discussion on the Canvas site, really enjoying those nuggets and the responses. It's really working out quite well. I hope you're having as good a time as I am with this. I know you're having some really good ideas about these readings and some good discussions. So thank you for that. But I wanted to just sort of briefly cover some of the topics that really struck me about this chapter. And again, I know some of this you've already talked about on the site, but uh, why not? I'll delve a little more into it. So, these are kind of what I see as the key ideas of Ellis. One is that there's this understanding of the word essay that has been in sort of common use now for quite a while. And it's actually problematic, incompatible with earlier notions. He says these earlier notions are actually a lot less rigid and more exploratory. And I did go back and read some of Montaigne's essays. I don't know if you've ever come across his work, but indeed, his essays remind me a lot more of something like NPR's This American Life, or some show like that. They're very sort of conversational, exploratory, and they're sort of drifting along on tangents and things. And it's a lot more voice, a lot more I don't want to say autobiographical stuff in there, but it's definitely quite a different experience than reading an academic article. You definitely wouldn't mistake one of Montaigne's essays for that. But the second idea is that, yes, if you have that sort of standard 5-paragraph essay model in mind, then if you ask students to make a multimedia essay based on that, they're going to churn out the 5-paragraph model. It's not going to be very original. It's not going to be very creative. Sort of what we saw in the last chapter with Cheryl Ball, right? But his point is, if we go with this earlier model instead, then the multimedia essay will be really helpful and sort of expand on the ideas presented in this the print version they'll write first. So I think this is a pretty interesting argument, and I wanted to delve a little into it here. So first, what exactly does Ellis mean by the word essay? A lot of people were talking about this in their nuggets. And he says at one point that when we say that we're assigning essays in our classes, what we're really assigning are articles, more like mini journal articles than we are essays. So what are some of the differences here? Ellis says that the essay, properly understood, privileges ideas over a thesis. And he doesn't like the word, he doesn't seem to like thesis in the sense of, at one point he says it's kind of like putting your conclusion first. We talk about put your thesis in the first paragraph, right? What are you arguing? What's your position on it? Maybe even what's your supporting evidence for this. So it's kind of presented almost to the reader as, I've thought this through, I've done the research, and I'm going to summarize the results of my research here in this paper. Whereas the earlier notion was more like, here's some ideas I have. Let me explore these ideas. Let me take you on the journey through my thinking process on this. And if you read Montaigne's essays, that's exactly what you see. I mean, he's got quotations in there from all sorts of sources, sort of what citations, I guess, would say. But he's using them more as like little springboards to get at the topic in several different ways, different perspectives, brings in his own experience a lot of the times. So it really is more of a journey. It's sort of like you're there with him as he's thinking through this topic, which is quite a bit different of a model, I think, than the standard, 5-paragraph with a thesis statement and supporting paragraphs and whatnot. A lot more narrative, a lot more conversational in style, a lot more voice. This concern of voice is really big for creative writing faculty and students too, right? You don't want this sort of robotic, academic sounding tone. You want to feel like you're reading something written by a human being, not a robot, right? So I really like this idea. I want to start. It's just really caused me to rethink some of the ways that I've been approaching 191, and I've probably been guilty of privileging too much of a article-like approach over the something more creative, something more like the old school essay, I guess, for lack of a better term. And there's an interesting point too. I was reminded of creative writing classes where we talk about show, don't tell. And he says the same thing about a really good essay. It has lots of imagery. It's very visual. What we'd say showing rather than telling. So he says students who've learned to craft these vivid essays already have experience appealing to an audience visually. I thought this was an interesting point. I'm kind of curious what you think about this. Do you see a relationship between the sort of visuals in a piece of writing versus the visuals in a multimedia or some kind of video project? Another point that he makes is about we're really training students to be critics more so than we're teaching them to be writers. And I thought this sort of got to me. I thought a lot about this. He says students in many courses are conditioned to think of artistic and literary works as products to critique, not text to create. And I've seen this. This seems to be a pretty common problem in a lot of classes, right? When we hear this is one of the reasons why a lot of compositionists resist the notion of using literature in a first-year writing class, because what they're thinking is exactly this problem, right? This literature, quote unquote, will be presented to the students as something to critique, but also something that's far above what they could ever produce themselves. I mean, their job is just to respond to it, not try to match it or equal it. Whereas this more essay-driven approach, that would be the idea, right? Is we're reading things, and you're going to be writing something similar to these things that we're reading. So that's a very powerful thought. He also talks about how the essays are more about their ideas and their own voices, not just regurgitating or ventriloquizing. Not sure how to pronounce this word. Ventriloquize. Anyway, I hope you see what he's getting at there, right? Just mimicking the voices of the critics. So again, you might be able to sound more like an academic critic of a text, but does that mean you can write a text? It's a good point. And also this idea of rewarding risk takers over those who play it safe. Sometimes students, I feel like they're quoting a lot, they're citing a lot as a way to kind of protect themselves, so to armor themselves in a way, instead of just going off and saying sort of what they think for fear that it's wrong or incorrect or something. So these are all good ideas, I think. I want to get you to respond to all three, but I would appreciate if you would respond to one of these points and let me know what you think about them. Oh, and here's a nice quotation from, I guess this is Robert Alwan, editor of the Best American Essays. And I know a lot of teachers use this collection, or there's several editions, I guess, but they're really nice collections. But anyway, this was a good quotation from Alwan I wanted to focus in on here. So he says, what was especially maddening about the typical 5-paragraph theme had less to do with its tedious structure than with its implicit message that writing should be the end product of thought and not the enactment of its process. So I just think this is, again, a really delightful thought here. I think it really kind of gets at what, I'm really glad Ellis included this quotation because I think it does a good job of summing up what he sees as the problem with essays, right? That this really, there's nothing, I guess, wrong necessarily with 5 paragraphs. The problem is, though, if the paragraphs, again, are designed more as a report of prior research rather than part of the research process itself. We talk in writing studies and composition about writing itself as a mode of thinking or as a mode of researching, but you can use writing to explore topics, not just present results. So great quotation, love that. Okay, moving on then to multimedia essays, which I think he didn't really spend a lot of time making this point clear, but what I imagine the objection to his approach would be, why are you having them write essays in print first and then having them adapt those into multimedia essays? Why, sort of like you're a slave to the print paradigm or whatever. But he makes some pretty good arguments, I think, against that idea, that he's not just privileging the printed form. He says that, again, if you going back to this older definition of essays, it's not such a a rigid process. So they could be, what's he say? They may be even more engaging vehicle for exploring identities than print. I think I would agree with this first point here. I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of Ellis's ideas, but I can see, and one of the reasons why, for example, on the Canvas site, I have you do not just text comments, but I like to see videos and audio. I do think that when you're presenting yourself in a video format or an audio, even just an audio version, that seems to be more you somehow, right? It's like you're putting more of yourself into that. At least that's the way it comes across to me. I'm a lot more self-conscious when I'm making a video than when I'm just making a text comment. So I'm curious what you think about that idea. He also, for similar reasons, forbids them from using pre-made images in songs and video clips. You know, and I've seen this a lot too. I don't know how many of you have assigned students to do videos and things, but a lot of temptation is there just to grab one of their favorite songs and have that blaring, and you can barely hear what they're saying. And I thought he made a good point too about if they bring in like Hollywood movie clips and intersperse those, that it's really jarring. And when you go back to their sort of amateurish production, it's actually a lot more authentic and compelling if they don't do that. And so these are all good points, but again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. The best student multimedia projects are inevitably the ones that contain nearly all original material. So very curious what you think on that point. I'll just stop and let you respond. And then I love this point he kind of throws in here at the end about so-called digital natives that require no training. You know, I've heard this countless times, this idea that these students are young, they were born with iPhones or whatever in their hands, or far more technologically savvy than we are. You can just say, hey, go make a video, and they'll know how to do that without any training. So he poo-poos that notion quite rightfully, I think. Clearly, not all of our students have these technological skills, and I think they appreciate it when we teach them how to do these things. And then a little point here about transferable skills. This is another notion. Sometimes it comes up. Why are you having your students do multimedia essays? It's not like they're going to be making multimedia essays for a living. I think you can make the same argument about any kind of essay, right? You know, how many people are going to be professional writers, etc. But the idea is, well, when we develop these skills, they can transfer into other skills. So if you learn how to make a multimedia essay, that process of learning how to do that can transfer to other processes that you might actually use at a job site, right? And so he kind of argues around this idea a little bit. He says, focusing on the genre of the essay does have the potential to give students a valuable ability to think, not only critically, but originally. So I think that's a pretty good point there too, especially keeping in mind this exploratory notion, this intellectual journey motif of an essay. I could imagine students using that quite often, no matter what it is they're trying to learn how to do. If they're paying attention to how they're thinking about it and things they're learning as they go, it's almost kind of like they're journaling as they're learning something and reflecting on it. I think certainly that would help and be very transferable to just about everything. Anyway, I think I've gone on enough about this article. If there's points you would like me to consider, questions you have, or anything like that, please share them. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much for watching.